Some of us might not know that grapefruit juice does not mix well with certain drugs. It can dramatically affect the way drugs are processed in the body. So today we're going to talk about that and discover why this common citrus fruit plays an interesting role in drug metabolism. So before we get into the specifics, let's briefly cover drug interactions. So number one here. A drug interaction is when one drug affects another, or in number two's case, when a certain food or drink can affect the drug. Both result in very similar things. The effect can be an enhancement of side effects or a reduced effectiveness of the drug itself, of the original drug that you consumed. There are a decent amount of us who have not been prescribed any drugs, but a lot of us have taken things like Tylenol or ibuprofen. If you ever read a label on any drug that you consume, you will always see that there's a section that gives you instructions on what not to take while you're taking that drug. Usually it's another prescription or something like that. It's because when you're consuming one drug, another drug that you could be taking can clash with the original. There are many examples of this. If you just take a random bottle of Tylenol or ibuprofen and read the back label, you'll see the list of things that you should not consume, among other things like how much to consume on a day-to-day basis. A lot of us are aware that alcohol and drugs do not mix well. Oftentimes when you take any drug, literally any drug, there will be a label that says do not consume with alcohol. And there are many examples, things like antibiotics, antidepressants, opioids, antihistamines, benzodiazepines. In my video on lean or codeine with promethazine, we talked about how mixing this drug with something like Xanax could result in death because the nervous system can be so depressed or quote unquote relaxed that you stop breathing. And this effect is also present with opioids and benzodiazepines. You never want to mix alcohol, especially with these two. But in general, alcohol and drugs just do not mix. It's a big safety concern. Now that we've done a general overview of drug interactions, let's dive into grapefruit juice and what this has to do with the breakdown or processing of drugs that we can consume on a day-to-day basis. Grapefruits and other citrus fruits have all kinds of interesting chemicals in them. In grapefruit, the chemicals of concern, at least with this topic, are called furanocoumarins. Here I have two, bergaptol and bergaptan. These are the structures right here. These molecules play an interesting role in drug metabolism, or the processing or the breakdown of certain drugs. So consider Xanax. Let's say you take a Xanax. Let's zoom in here. So you consume a Xanax, and let's say you also consume some grapefruit juice. So when the Xanax is processed in your stomach and your liver goes through something called a first pass. I spoke about this in another video of mine, but essentially the liver is the great filter of the human body. Whenever we consume a drug, whether it's Tylenol or Xanax or an antidepressant, our body doesn't need all of that substance. So our liver takes the responsibility of processing those things and eventually reducing their concentration in our blood. So in reality, when we consume these things, only a small amount gets in the blood because we don't need the rest. Now, when it comes to processing drugs, we have these molecules, I'll call them the CYPs. I'll talk about this in a second. But I mentioned these furanocoumarins because these two molecules, or there's a couple others, these molecules can block these CYPs from functioning. Now, these CYPs are enzymes. They help break down these drugs. So number two here, we just mentioned this first pass. So the goal is to detoxify and inactivate the drugs to reduce the concentration. And these things I'm calling CYPs are molecules known as the cytochrome P450s. These molecules in this giant family of enzymes or molecular structures that will break down substances, including drugs. The cytochrome P450 family is pretty much responsible for about 75% of drug metabolism, drug breakdown. So these are very important enzymes in this whole process of eventually reducing drug concentration so we're not poisoned by a large amount of any substance that we consume. These furanocoumarins, these molecules that are present in grapefruit, can oftentimes stop these enzymes from breaking down drugs, which result in a whole host of different symptoms. It's important to note that grapefruit juice also affects drug transporters. There are some drugs that are transported across the body, like you would be transported from one location to another in a car. We're not going to talk much about that, but I just wanted to mention that. We're really going to focus on this cytochrome P450 family. I did mention that there were other citrus fruits. There have been studies on Seville oranges, and these can also affect metabolism. But a lot of the research that I've seen is on grapefruit juice, and that's just what I've heard about in my lifetime. In the last slide, we mentioned that these molecules, brigaptol, brigaptin, the furanocoumarins, can block the action of these enzymes, this P450 family. Now, when it comes to this interaction, there are three factors involved. Usually it involves a medication taken orally, like a pill or a capsule. Usually when this medication is consumed, the amount available decreases. I mentioned the first pass effect. And usually the specific cytochrome P450 family member is called CYP3A4. This specific one processes the vast majority of drugs that we consume. So let's go back to our Xanax example. So we talked about consuming Xanax with some grapefruit juice. And in that example, we talked about this family of enzymes that will help break down this substance. Now we're bringing in the piece that these molecules will block that effect. So it's going to stop this stuff from working. So instead of a reduced drug concentration, you get an increased drug concentration. So number two, it's important to note that this all depends on the specific drug and not the drug type. I've mentioned in my other videos that drugs are a part of families. This effect takes place with all sorts of different drugs, but it often takes place with a few drugs within a family, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. Some other members of this enzyme family can be CYP1A2. This affects the processing of caffeine. CYP2D6 can affect the processing of a drug like Adderall. But regardless, everyone is different. The amount of grapefruit juice, our body chemistry, everyone operates differently on a biological level. The most important thing, though, is when you're consuming any drug to read the labels, because the labels will always tell you, hey, do not consume this with grapefruit juice. If you get a drug from a pharmacy, sometimes the instructions will be, outside of how to take it, do not consume with grapefruit juice, or do not consume with this thing or that thing. These are things we have to take seriously because drug interactions are very, very real. You do not want to consume a drug that has a certain purpose and then you consume grapefruit juice, for example, and you get an exacerbated effect of symptoms that you do not want. Lastly, let's just talk about some effective drugs and adverse reactions. It's important to note that there are many drugs that are affected by things like grapefruit juice. You can find a whole list of them. I'm just going to list a few. If you consume grapefruit juice with some of these substances, it can increase the amount of undesired side effects, which could be dangerous. It could also reduce the drug effectiveness, which could also be dangerous. Let's consider something like Lipitor for high cholesterol. Viagra can also be affected by grapefruit juice. One of the warnings of Viagra is that you could have a side effect where you have an erection that lasts more than a handful of hours. This may sound fun, but it is not, because if your erection lasts too long, it can be painful. You'll have to go to the ER, and they'll have to inject your penis with a solution to bring the erection down. It's not a fun time. Now, I'm not sure about the specifics of the grapefruit interaction, but you can see where I'm going. You do not want an increased adverse reaction. Something like Allegra, the antihistamine that a lot of people consume, or amlodipine. This is a blood pressure medication. Let's say you consume this medication and grapefruit juice. Well, this medication will reduce your blood pressure, but what if that effect is strengthened? So now you go from having maybe a stable blood pressure to your blood pressure being dangerously low. These are just some of the few examples of this drug interaction. Like I said, this whole grapefruit juice thing, it depends on the person, but it's just not safe to take certain substances with grapefruit juice. I know this video is very general because I couldn't get into all the specifics, but I think you guys know where I'm going. This drug interaction can be dangerous. So let's go through the summary and review what we learned and covered today. We briefly went over drug interactions. We learned that one drug can affect another. Certain foods or drinks can affect drugs. We have to look at the labels and understand that usually when we consume a drug, there is something out there that reacts with it in ways that we don't want. We also mentioned alcohol and other drugs. This is an interaction that a lot of us are familiar with. Then we talked about grapefruit juice, how it has these molecules called furanocoumarins. These can affect the normal processing of drugs. The drugs move through the body, gets processed by these enzymes to reduce the concentration. Well, these molecules can stop those enzymes from working. And we also mentioned these enzymes are responsible for about 75% of drug metabolism. We then talked further how these molecules block these enzymes from working and can increase drug concentration. And this does depend on the specific drug. We spoke about some other enzymes and other drugs. And I made a point that everyone's different, but we always have to read the labels and instructions when we're consuming any kind of substance, especially when it comes to drug interactions. We then closed out talking about some affected drugs like Lipitor, Viagra, amlodipine, Allegra. And bringing it all together, we did discuss the increase of undesired side effects, but these interactions can also reduce the effectiveness of the drugs we're consuming. In general, we learned that grapefruit juice and many drugs that are consumed and that we consume just do not mix. The results can be very dangerous. They're also very unpredictable. So to wrap it up, when we're consuming drugs, we have to be aware of what else we're putting in our body at or around the same time, because that could affect the way our body processes the drug that we are consuming. So that's all I got. I know this was very general, but I hoped it did instruct some of you guys, and I hope it gave some more illumination to those who have heard of this phenomenon. So as always, thank you guys so much for watching and listening. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Tell your friends, and I'll be back soon with another video.